I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Beatriz Luna. She's a Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh, where she runs the Laboratory for Neurocognitive Development. Bea is an expert on the development of the dopamine reward system and inhibitory control and how they interact in decision making. Bea, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We've got very similar research interests in reward and control processes. And I came at it from a very philosophical perspective. I was interested in free will and how does neurodevelopment impact decision making. And I wanted to stay broad in that philosophical space. So then reward and control, it's like almost as broad as you could get. So that's how I came here. Was it a similar story for you?
No. So, I've always been interested in development, initially in childhood development, but adolescence has always been something that's been important to me, from the fact that I was kind of a crazy adolescent, but
Hmm.
realizing that I was going through a very unique time of the lifespan that was going to have a long-term impact. So for me, it's really been about um, what are the neurobiological processes that support the type of decision making that adolescents do, and why does that happen, and how, the most important thing, what are the processes that support that transition from adolescence to now this is who you're going to be as an adult.
It's especially prone to stereotypes. You hear all these things about adolescents are these huge risk takers and they've got like adult bodies but childlike minds and all of this stuff. How much of that is true or not?
Well, I can fill the whole podcast with this, but more generally, yeah, it's very interesting that sensation seeking is peaking in adolescence. And that's present across cultures and across species. It's even been found in rodents and so forth. And people are like, oh, these crazy teenagers, oh, why do they do that? But in fact, more and more, we believe and others that it is adaptive. It is, the brain is going through specific changes that support and encourage exploration that is needed, to get that sort of feedback to start to form what the trajectory is going to be. Of course, when you're peaking on sensation seeking, that can turn into risk-taking behavior, which means that your survival is undermined. So you see things like, peaks in substance use and peaks in crime, the mortality rate increases and so forth. So it has plus and minuses, but overall, for the majority, it is a very, crucial, important aspect of being able to specialize your brain and behavioral systems by gaining these experiences.
So neurobiologically, the peak happens relatively earlier than the behavioral peaks in risk taking, and that's probably due to increased autonomy and social forces, right? Like if drug use or reckless driving tend to peak maybe 18 to early 20s, if I'm remembering right. But then on the neurobiological end of sensation seeking and the dopamine processes you're talking about, that's more like mid to late teens, right?
Okay. So when you talk about when you talk about the dopamine system, it's very complex.
Hmm.
So you have like, how much dopamine do I have? Right? Which is what we call presynaptic dopamine. And then you have, how many receptors do I have? Who are going to match with how much dopamine you have. And those seem to be having different developmental trajectories. So what we have published and what we know from, the animal models is that the amount of presynaptic dopamine that you have, and this is in the striatum, really in the brain, the limbic part of the brain that has to do with rewards. We see in vivo, and it's been there are markers of this in postmortem, etc., is that there's an increase in how much dopamine you have. And in the reward part of this part of the brain, it starts to stabilize a little bit, but continues to increase. That's how much dopamine you're going to have. what we have found in vivo in humans, which is really great, we use PET, um, and it involves a radioactive isotope. So for that part, we only looked at 18 to 30-year-olds. And what we found surprisingly was that the receptors, specifically D2, D3 receptors, in this part of the reward brain decreases with age. So there's a particular relationship between how much dopamine you have and how many receptors you have that, is part of this whole period of plasticity that would be hard to say, oh, it's done by 18 or it's done by 20 or something
Mhm.
of that range because it's very dynamic. But some of the models that we've been starting to construct um, really tries to bring these two aspects of this neurotransmitter dopamine that has to do with reward because of certain other findings that we've been finding in like big data sets where like substance use, it peaks around mid-adolescence to late adolescence. And, it literally peaks and then it goes down in the majority of adolescents, but predominantly in those who have less of that dopamine availability. And why would that, mean that you have more sensation seeking and so forth? So this is a way that we've been looking at it. You don't have all the dopamine that you're gonna have yet. You have a lot of receptors because you haven't lost them yet. So now you have this dopamine that's trying to match up to the receptors, and it's taking longer to get that going. And perhaps, um, and it's something that's been proposed in the past as well, that the sensation seeking is a form of compensatory reward processing to reach a higher level. So you have that higher substance use. And what we've been, these preliminary results are showing that those with more dopamine availability are not showing that bump in substance use. And we see that for delinquency, et cetera. So yeah, the timing of development for cognition, we had that more than 10,000 people because we looked at all these different big data sets. And when we look at this cognitive development, it is definitely like increasing like crazy, decelerating in adolescence, and reaching adult levels by 18. Um, and then when you look at sensation seeking, which is something that one of my grad students who's faculty in Minnesota, Brendan Turvo Clemens, he used a data set of more than 1 million individuals and found that it's peaking in adolescence. And when you superimpose both of them, you get the model that we've been proposing for, I don't know, 20 years, the driven dual systems model, which is unique because it says by adolescence, right, you have access to adult level executive function. It's unstable yet, right? There's a lot of variability, which is a whole other aspect of being adaptive. And it is at a time when you have a peak in all these sensation seeking sorts of behaviors underlined by, these associations in the reward system. So that what ends up happening in adolescence is kind of like, oh, shoot, I've got this executive function. I can plan, I can make these choices. I don't need to ask mom and dad. And it's being driven, that's why we put the word driven, by the fact that there's this increase rewarding motivation. So the way that we've been looking at this is that in adolescence, the brain is like, all right, you've got everything that you're going to have. You're the height pretty much of what you're going to be. You have all your cognitive abilities. You have access to them. All right, now we're going to give you a push, with the dopaminergic processing, etc. We're going to push you. Please go out there, get me new experiences because I need to make some. This is the brain talking. I
Mhm.
need to make some decisions. What am I going to myelinate? What am I going to, uh, not myelinate as much? What circuitry are we going to make predominant? So, in order to be able to make those decisions, you need the person to go out there and find their own independent sources of experience. So it's not mom and dad holding your hand, taking you somewhere. It's you saying, I want to go and experience this. I want to go and experience that. and then the brain could calculate that.
It was the later decrease in dopamine receptor levels, but not dopamine levels themselves. Is that part of some use it or lose it pruning process where the existing reward associations are strengthened and then the rest of it goes down, like the value of exploration for its own sake goes down?
Yes, I love that you said that, Adam, because that's very much how we look at plasticity, particularly in the adolescent period. It's a Hebbian process of use it or lose it. And in the broader scheme of things, the way that we look at it is that you're born with with a neurobiological predisposition, genetically informed, et cetera. And sometimes I refer to this as your ID card. It's who you are. And to a particular environment. And then the brain, all through infancy and childhood, is trying to see how we're going to, you know, adapt to this in a use it or lose it fashion. And then there's unique aspects of plasticity that are occurring during adolescence that will take that information and then make decisions as to what is going to stay, what is going to go. And the brain is not trying to be good or bad. It's just what you fed it. So with it's a whole other, what one of the ways that I've been looking at predominantly in psychopathology, not completely, but predominantly, is that it's maybe another way to look at it is not that a part of the brain is broken, and that's why you have depression or bipolar disorder or whatever. It's actually that you fed it this genetic predisposition in an environment, and the brain was like, okay, you're using this a lot. We're going to cement this. And if the cementing meant use less of certain parts of that brain, it's not because it's broken. It's because that's how the brain adapted. And that's why you see psychopathology, like mood disorders, addiction, etc., emerging during this period from adolescence to adulthood.
It's interesting from an evolutionary perspective when people argue that different forms of psychopathology could be filling different niches. Like, even if you have a more depressive temperament, you're expending less energy, and in some rare environments, that could be more adaptive.
I could not agree with you more with that. I often, the conversations I have with my mentees when they're interested in clinical, I mean, we really study normative, but we're in a psychiatry department. We have studied clinical populations in the past. Um, I really say, suspend your beliefs in saying this is bad or this is good. It is what it is. And like you are suggesting, it just so happens that certain mental illnesses are not adaptive in today's society. And it might have been more adaptive when there were other requirements in the environment.
Robert Sapolsky has a similar argument for that for schizophrenia, and from what I remember, it's the idea that it's a really low proportion of the population that develops full-blown schizophrenia, but if there are other genes associated with, say, increased creativity, if there's enough of an adaptive benefit on a population level that if you have, say, only one of the recessives as opposed to two, then, it could be selected for at a global level, even if in the minority case where it's maladaptive, that could persist at some stable low rate.
Oh no, he's fantastic. And I do like that approach. I mean, the way that I've always been thinking about schizophrenia, which is fascinating, it's been 1% throughout history. It's never
Mhm.
increased. So that could speak to evolutionary processes. And one thing that I've been saying for many years, and this is all opinion and speculation, um, is that perhaps in primitive cultures, it was very adaptive to have that individual who could talk to nature, who could think in that
Mhm.
way that is not typical. And maybe it would have been the witch doctor and, and maybe the spiritual leader and so forth. Because why has it always maintained? Of course, now it's not adaptive and it continues to be 1%.
Uh-huh. Yeah, he had a similar argument for OCD. I don't know whether it was controversial or not, but you see a lot of similarities between the rituals that you see in different religions and the OCD, like cleansing type rituals. Like, you have to do this many times at these hours. And, at a population level, cultural evolution wise, it could be that you get something that's good because a lot of the rituals have to do with cleaning and context of sex or food, like where there could be pathogens involved. And
Uh,
then in a minority case, it can be taken to a pathological extreme, but could it be the case that you have selection, especially for the types of people, if you imagine low level schizophrenic or OCD like traits, whereas you mentioned you could be a shaman or a witch doctor, you're talking to nature and coming up with these rules and maybe having intuitions that it's bad to have these types of potentially pathogenic foods. And it turns into, you create a giant narrative around it. The narrative itself doesn't necessarily have to be true for it to be culturally selected.
yeah, and, and if it remains, evolutionarily, it was
Hmm.
adapted. Although when it comes to OCD, which I also find quite fascinating, and, there's some colleagues here at Pittsburgh that do amazing rodent level work and so forth. What I've always thought about OCD is, are these rituals the disorder, or is that what has emerged to deal with what the real problem is, which is this deep anxiety?
Hmm.
And this is a calming fashion. But I take what you're saying, which I find very interesting, that why was that the selection of the compensatory mechanisms, that help control this very high level of anxiety?
In general, I'm a big fan of these evolutionary explanations, but then you also have the critical perspective, which is anything could be just a post hoc story you're telling, like an
Oh,
evolutionary spandrel. And then back to the increase in sensation seeking, I've heard some people argue that this is specifically selected for that it makes sense for as you're becoming an independent adult, then you want to be exploring more, and that could be something uniquely selected for. And then the other argument, the spandrel type one, would say, well, yes, reward and control systems develop at different rates, and that leads to this maturational gap that could increase sensation seeking, but it doesn't have to be selected for or adaptive. It could just be a result of the neurobiology, like the actual order in which the systems develop and whatever biological constraints there are imposed that lead to those different developmental trajectories.
yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Hmm.
You know, evolutionary adaptation could very well, have had a hand in the fact that there's different developmental trajectories. Um, and it can be adapted. So, the rodent studies, some of the rodent studies, what they have found is that those rats that venture outside of the safe space around the nest, right? They're being more exploratory and sensation seeking. If they don't get killed by a predator, they have a higher survival rate. So
Hmm.
so there is this aspect of adaptation that occurs. Now, another aspect that mm, also might be more like, biologically timetable determined is puberty,
Hmm.
and how that plays a role with dopamine and with executive function, and the timing of these periods, and with plasticity, is something that we're all trying to understand as much as we can. And puberty can change. It has been found that given stressors, racial differences, and so forth, that puberty can actually change. And it could very well have an impact in the timing of both cognitive and reward processing itself.
If for someone who now studies puberty as a primary research topic, it's funny to me looking back how much I neglected to consider it, even once I got involved in adolescent research. Because again, I was coming at it from this philosophical perspective of what is it that happens in the brain that takes someone you go from this blameless child to responsible adult, and part of that is a sociocultural change, but I was thinking about, again, changes in reward and control processing influencing decision making, and puberty was almost an afterthought, like it happens during this age range, but I was thinking maybe it's something to control for, and it wasn't until I started reading all the animal studies and this evolutionary theory, thinking of puberty really as a driving force, and especially thinking about it in the context of sex, like you mentioned, high risk, high reward strategies from, especially for males, from the perspective of how many offspring can you leave? Like, you could imagine all different configurations of pursuing a stable strategy and having relatively low rates of offspring versus these high risk, high reward, where most die and don't leave any, but the small number that do succeed are hyper successful and you get those evolutionary trade offs working.
No, I agree with that. I mean, that's what the main aim is, right? Passing your genes to the having your genes survive and persist. Um, yeah, I mean, puberty, as I'm sure that you're learning, is extremely difficult to dissociate from chronological age, number 1. Number 2, yes, it is driven by all these different hormones at different times of puberty that differ by sex. So that
Mhm,
also makes it, more difficult. So in our lab, we've been trying to look at puberty. We have published some of this work as well. And now, which I think you guys as well, we have we're getting information about the different particular hormones and how those are changing.
mhm,
And it is complex and it is not, straightforward like we thought it was going to be. And one of my grad students, Omar Ravindranath, who already got her PhD, she's doing her internship. Um, she told me something once, and I've never forgotten. She's like, Bea, puberty is more than just the hormones. And I'm like, and all of a
mhm,
sudden, when I think of Tanner and Peterson, which I was always like, those self-report measures about your bodily changes. So then I'm like, wait a minute. That might be the comprehensive view that we need to know when we're talking about puberty. Because, puberty is not just estrogen. It's not just testosterone. Um, and so, but even beyond that, when you look at the hormones, there are some more direct associations with changes in dopamine, for example, that could really tell us more, and we're investigating that now. And then finally, one thing that I've thought for a long time is that puberty could be a trigger for different types of maturational processes. That we're trying to test some of the hypotheses with the thinking that you have a special type of maturation early on that's about accumulation. And then maybe when you reach puberty, when in puberty is an important aspect that we need to find out. It might be, these hormonal changes and so forth saying, you know what? Now it's time to specialize. So we're going to shift gears in the time of brain maturational processes that are happening, and we're going to start specializing and then stabilizing. So there are a lot of amazing questions that we can finally start to look at. And um, Adam, you can always come and do a postdoc. We have a lot of
yeah.
amazing data.
Is that last point related to the excitation-inhibition balance that you've written about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's been so this all emerged with conversations that I used to have with Bart Larson when he was a grad student, and now he's faculty in Minnesota. Um, and if you've heard my talks, I think I talk about that. And we're like, oh, adolescence, people say, it's a sensitive period. And I'm like, what does that even mean, sensitive? It's either sensitive or is it critical period plasticity? We know what critical period plasticity is. We know from the visual system that it has to do with the breaking of the balance of excitation and inhibition. So, and I use the example from vision. You're born, you open your eyes, you get all this visual stimulation, which engages very high excitation relative to the inhibitory systems that you have that. And when that is broken, that is a trigger. Okay, time to go and reorganize that part of cortex so it can process this very high excitation sort of information so you can recover, and have the optimal SNR. Anyway, so we're thinking, okay, excitation inhibition, sensory systems are already online and they are bringing very high level signal to places like prefrontal cortex. And postmortem studies and animal studies show that there are aspects of the excitatory system that have to do with glutamate, which reflect heightened aspects in prefrontal cortex. And in other studies that show that specific aspects of inhibitory GABAergic function is actually decreased and increasing in adolescence. So we did a in vivo neuroimaging study at 7 Tesla using spectroscopic imaging where we could look at GABA and GLU, look at the balance, and we found yes, in fact, we are seeing that there's more excitation, less inhibition, and that is recovered from adolescence to adulthood in prefrontal cortex. And now we've used EEG that has an approach that also speaks to EI balance. We also find that we are writing a paper now using Hurst, the Hurst component. I don't know if you know about this. But anyways, for people listening to it, it's a way to look at brain imaging data when people are doing nothing and trying to see how predictive the time series can be. It's actually using an approach that's been used to predict stock market changes and so forth, but now it's been
Mhm.
used in the brain, and it is supposed to be reflecting inhibitory function. And therefore, that change in excitatory and in inhibitory processing should be reflected in the Hurst. And we're also saying that there aids development difference. So we've hit this in very different ways to really, suggest something that's quite provocative, which is, hey, prefrontal cortex, which takes a long time to reach adult levels, which has this protracted synaptic pruning and so forth, is undergoing something akin to critical periplasticity. Although we have to be careful because when I've talked to my rodent and animal colleagues, they're like, you can't use plasticity when you're talking about those type of things.
Uh-huh.
It's more about it, just adaptation of those systems. But in any case, yeah.
This has been a mystery to me for a while because it makes sense that, well, plasticity during development, really at any stage, is going to be higher. But the canonical story is it starts highest the earliest back you go, like talking prenatally or in infancy, and then it steadily declines. And then, even if for subcortical regions that mature earlier or sensory motor regions, they're more mature by childhood, and done by adolescence, and then it's for these association cortices that are latest to develop, and plasticity stays relatively higher. But it's not just that they're slower, so plasticity is higher than other regions. The argument is it's even higher than childhood, right? There's something maybe pubertal hormone driven that shifts that EI balance higher in adolescence, even than compared to like late childhood.
Yeah, okay, so there are a few things going on here. One is regional differences. Magnitude of plasticity, I not something that I have looked at or even know how I would look at to compare from different regions. And another thing that I really want to make clear, yes, prefrontal takes a long time. So does the striatum.
Hmm.
It's not like the basal ganglion, the reward system, matures earlier. Absolutely not. We have found, people have found it with structural, changes that are occurring, dopaminergic changes that are occurring. So both of them are taking a really, really long time, D2, D3 receptor changes and so forth. So I really think it's maybe a different type of plasticity. So there's this one researcher, Doug Field at the National Institute of Child Development, whose work blows my mind. So he looks at adult rodents and they learn something. And he's able to zoom in to the axons, and he can see when they're learning that astrocytes, so, these other creatures in the brain, are, being guided by other neurons saying, hey, we're learning this. We need to myelinate this, this tract here. And they literally go on the track in like Spider-Man, are spinning the freaking myelin. It's just mind blowing. And what blows my mind even more is that then they go to other tracks and they're like, this one needs to quiet down. And it picks off the myelin. And he shows
Hmm.
this in his talks. Anyways, the
Wow.
reason I bring this up is that is for learning. We're always learning. I'm always learning. There's construction in the main road that I take. I've got to learn how to go to another place. So what I've been saying, and something that we, are investigating now, and we have some preliminary evidence that might be able to dissociate this, which is plasticity that has to do with the adolescent period that's very pronounced and maybe, very much focused in prefrontal, maybe striatal regions, really changing organization. And then there's persistent plasticity that allows even an old lady like me to learn a new route on how to get home. So there are different types of plasticities that are all environmentally driven, all invited, driven by the way that we can use our neurobiology to adapt, but different degrees, different aspects of plasticity that may be reflective in at the layer level of the cortex that, might be more amenable to this consistent plasticity that we want to keep versus, these other sorts of plasticity that might be in other parts of in another cortical layer that has to do maybe more with long-term connectivity that will help us determine what the base function will be in your adult trajectory. And then within that, you have the persistent plasticity for learning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then I'm trying to piece it with the puberty argument because there could be plasticity changes that are just age dependent. I don't know what the specific mechanism would be, but then puberty would be, obviously overlapping with that. But you talked about individual differences in pubertal timing. Is it the hormones themselves that are doing it more, or is it just this broader developmental effect?
Yeah, Adam, that's what you need to figure out. Get to work. Like I said before, it's going to be more complex than we realize
Hmm.
because it's not just going to be one hormone. And one thing that it's like classic Bea in the lab is that I like to look at relativeness of things. So not just testosterone, but that how is the amount of testosterone related to all these other
Hmm.
different hormones and different aspects of things that are going that, so it's more about, this complex of things that come together that have a specific effect. Now, you're right. I mean, puberty might be intimately related and probably is, if this is a true thing, on this particular plasticity that you see in adolescence. Right? Which might be, very much like go reorganize prefrontal circuits, their connectivity to, motivational and limbic areas, not just the striatum, but also the amygdala. And we've published on this, the hippocampus, but all of them together are forming a unique aspect of plasticity.
The heuristic that I've gotten from my read, both the human puberty neurodevelopment research and the animal hormone studies, like for example, the testosterone influencing striatal dopamine signaling, is that it's really subcortical, limbic, socio-emotion processing regions. And then to the extent it's cortical, again, it's social, emotional, emotion regulation, more so than just cognitive control. And if it's something more cognitive, where you don't see any sex differences, that seems to be more age driven. And anything really more emotional, like I look towards the clinical research, if it's something that we know has a big sex difference, especially if it begins at puberty, like with anxiety and depression or sensation seeking, that it might be more driven by these hormones. And if it's something where you don't find a sex difference or anything radically different at puberty, it's probably more just an age effect.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you say. And, when we've looked at, at cognitive processes like inhibitory control in particular, we don't find predominant sex differences, right? And very difficult to find pubertal effects. But there are some aspects that you do see pubertal effects, and they may have to do with exactly what you're saying, which is, cognition does work with, these more emotional processing regions. Their connectivity is crucial for emotional regulation, etc. So in some ways, it's, puberty could be impacting that relationship and therefore also impacting cognitive development in that more indirect way.
Mhm.
But you're right, it would be more emotional. I mean, at the end of the day, what is puberty but the body saying, "Hey, you're ready to go reproduce.
Mhm.
Go social, be driven by emotions, fall in love, all that stuff so that you can start reproducing because now your organs are ready to go."
And then it seems so natural to look at that and say, okay, it must be driven by sex hormones. But as you mentioned, puberty is more than just the hormonal physiological changes, because often you'll see a stronger effect of puberty in girls. And when you think about influences of pubertal timing, like especially if a girl's body is changing earlier than her peers, and you start getting more potentially unwanted attention, like you see all these strong associations with risk taking and substance use and earlier unsafe sex, that that's not necessarily a biological effect. Like maybe it's true that the hormones are increasing the reward sensitivity component of it, but there's all these obvious social forces influencing behavior in that direction as well.
Absolutely. And, it's never just, as you know, the environment and the biology. It's
Mhm.
always action, and it's so true, um, early pubertal females who, at 12 or 13 already look like they're 16 or 17, the environment is going to treat them differently. And we go back to the Hebbian process, and you start accessing circuitries earlier than you would have if you would have had that more prolonged pubertal period. So yeah, yes, and that it is and that triggers social processing, emotion regulation, etc.
It's interesting how much overlap you do see with the evolutionary theories cross species, like with life history theory. Across species, you see that different species have different strategies. So, like mammals will have relatively few number of offspring and high investment, and most of them survive, and that's stable across time. And then you have fish and insects with thousands of eggs, most of them die, but enough survive that it's stable across time. And then within species, evolutionary psychologists borrowed that concept. And you see something similar. You see in more stable environments with higher levels of investment, you see relatively longer development and you see these long-termist strategies. It's like the famous marshmallow test. And then early adversity not only promotes risk taking, and you can think of the social explanations, but it accelerates pubertal timing, which is exactly what you'd predict from the evolutionary perspective. Like if you're in a dangerous environment, then you need to speed things up and leave your genes behind before you die. But that's only if it's a threat based form of adversity. If it's deprivation, like if you're malnourished, then puberty happens later, which also makes sense because you need to devote all your resources to surviving. And you'll think about reproduction later, which is really energetically costly once you can recoup those calories.
Yeah, I love your level of knowledge, and you may know even more than I do. Although we have a review paper out there that it's showing how stress can affect this excitatory inhibitory process of plasticity, and it can have this effect of making critical period plasticity end earlier
Hmm.
in many of the ways that you've explained, and this has been found in animal studies. Nim Tottenham has talked about it in her orphanage studies and so forth. That there's a period where the brain is like, you know what, enough fooling around. The stakes have gone out. You got to stop that, and in particular, you have to start engaging prefrontal cortex more predominantly.
Hmm.
And, that really, and, there's this whole discussion about how adolescence has become longer and longer and longer, especially in Western society. where you're really protected, you're going to college, your parents might be helping, you're getting a PhD, that's another period of, like, you're having kids way later, getting married later, so responsibilities aren't coming through, and that really struck me when I was giving a talk in UNICEF, this was years ago, and after my talk, "Oh, adolescent, blah, blah, blah," somebody came to me and said, "Hey, where I work, girls get married at 10 or 11, and they're having
Hmm.
kids." So adolescence is ending there if they even had any adolescence. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, it's like, my God, it's a total privilege to have
Hmm.
long period of specialization, so you can be a PhD. So people can have an MD, so you can choose the person who you really want to marry. So yeah, absolutely. I think that I think it's interesting what you said that there's a difference between threat and deprivation. And I'd love to talk, like, offline a little bit more about what
Uh-huh.
your processes might be for that, but I like the rationale
Yeah,
behind.
that would be great. That reminds me of a great perspectives piece by Willem Frankenhuis and Dorsa Amir. It's called What is the Expected Human Childhood? And they're taking this evolutionary cross-cultural perspective, basically saying that you see a lot of clinical research on the adversity exposed brain, and then you're comparing it to healthy controls, and you see these differences. And from the evolutionary perspective, and even cross-culturally, they're arguing that what we think of as a typically developing brain is actually this weird Western sheltered brain that's slow developing, and the adversity exposed brain is probably the evolutionary norm.
That is really interesting and impactful. That is very interesting. I mean, when I think of the most direct evidence of this prolonged adolescent, maturation is synaptic pruning in prefrontal cortex that started by Huttenlocher, which, by the way, I'm going to digress for 1 second because
Mhm,
Huttenlocher should have won the Nobel Prize. Peter Huttenlocher, we named it in flux. I decided we're gonna call it the Huttenlocher Award, which I won last year,
mhm,
you know, um, because of the incredible work that he did, and I'm digressing because, um, when he came up with these findings, he's obsessed looking, counting number of synapses. It's like, "Oh my god, they're decreasing with age." um, People are like, "What are you talking about? It's development. There's no way you're losing things." And, it took a while for people to actually say, "Oh, this is a real finding." Anyways, his
mhm.
daughter wrote a book about him. She's also a neuroscientist, which is just amazing. That you should look it up by Anna Huttenlocher. I forget the exact name of it. But yeah, in any case, when I think about that work that Huttenlocher did, and then, Pascal Rakic has done a lot of the postmortem work, I think with some of the same brains, and et cetera. I mean, these brains are from, I don't know, I would say the 60s or something like that. We don't know how much adversity they would have had, but it's certainly a different environmental circumstance than what we have nowadays.
Mhm.
Um, and there, I mean, the Huttenlocher saw stabilization of number of synapses by 16 or 18 or something in prefrontal. Patswara Kish, who has like way more advanced ways of looking at it, saw that it actually persists into the 30s.
Mhm.
So, there could be changes, but I really do like that. The brain that we're looking at now is the brain.
Yeah. There's a lot of public health research on the earlier pubertal timing over the last century as well. I used to work with Megan Herting at USC, and her
Oh,
neuroscience lab was in the public health department. So she's doing a lot of research in ABCD on how different environmental stressors like air pollution through neuroendocrine channels influence pubertal timing. And then there's other people in the same space looking at diet. And obviously in the West, there's been huge dietary changes. And even in animals, there's a bunch of primate research. Robert Sapolsky wrote about this one baboon troop that he was studying, and people came in and settled this area right next to a forest where they were. So basically, the baboons could come out into the city and steal human food and then go back to their jungle. And then they started gaining weight over time. And for a while, it actually seemed adaptive because they had more food access, and the humans who settled right next to them actually shoot off a lot of their natural predators. So they had all this abundance of food and fewer predators than they used to, and they were having more offspring, and they were developing faster, probably because of the higher body fat. It ended up kind of sad because he was doing all these biomeasures, like they started getting pre-diabetes because they were eating way more than they used to.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think they ended up catching a disease maybe from eating rotten human food, and the troop died off. But he published a lot of them over the course of
Yeah.
several decades, and it was really interesting seeing it was almost like, you know, Western colonialization in primates, and you see a lot of the same effects.
No, you know what? That just reminds me of a concept that I have in my lab for a long time, like the Greek concept, which is all about sweet spot. Too
Mhm,
little, too much, bad. You want that sweet spot. And, you know, there's a famous rodent study, very, very old, with a rodent population where they gave them everything that they wanted, total access to food, entertainment, or whatever. And it was a little bit similar. It was like flourishing, and then it took a turn that was horrible, and, you know, aggression and cannibalism, and it all of a sudden, the whole colony was ruled by the mean girls. It's
mhm,
like these rodent women who took over and undermined. It was horrendous. So you're right. I mean, even when I talk to stress, you know, so Maria Pariga is my grad student who's about to defend, who's interested in looking at stress and is looking at stress and so forth. You know, the fact that even stress has a sweet spot. Absolutely no stress could also be bad.
mhm,
You know, we know that a lot of stress is bad, but there's always a sweet spot. And there's also like, what is stress? When does it become stress? And all
uh-huh.
those other things.
That's the perfect segue to talk more about my past research with Megan. So no stress is bad, and my first project with her, it wasn't on typical development. It was children with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Have you heard of this?
No.
So the adrenal hyperplasia is overactive adrenal glands, congenital, present from birth. So they've got a genetic disorder and deficiency in an enzyme called 21 hydroxylase, which is necessary to synthesize cortisol. So prenatally, they're lacking cortisol, which, you know, is a stress hormone, but you need it at some baseline level just to regulate metabolism and all of that. So adrenal glands go into overdrive as a compensatory mechanism. Males who have it, even though eventually it needs to be treated with glucocorticoids, not much harmful effects in males. But for females, adrenal glands go into overdrive and they produce excess androgens, some of which are then converted to testosterone. So females have heightened levels of prenatal androgen exposure, which is a critical window for brain development and for sex differentiation. So, in the most extreme cases, if it goes left untreated, then females, it's classified as an intersex disorder because their genitalia can become masculinized by the testosterone. But even before it gets to that level, there's just subtle organizational effects of testosterone on the brain. So there have been a bunch of studies on girls with CAH, and during childhood, they're more tomboyish, more aggressive, more interested in roughhousing play. During adulthood, they're much more likely to identify as gay at a rate of 30 to 50% compared to 1% in the general population. So that points to some organizational effect prenatally of androgens on sexuality and personality, having a more masculine temperament. And that got me really interested in the organizational effect of sex hormones determining these sex differences. Also, spatial cognition, the biggest or only cognitive sex difference we have, they have improved more male typical levels of spatial cognition. And it's kind of a dose response relationship. Like the more severe, the more masculinized they've been. So if they have ambiguous genitalia and are classified as intersex, that would be the most extreme disorder. But for a lot of them, it's just they'll be identified as female. You don't know that anything's wrong until they do. This is now part of the standard screening you do on newborns. So most of them take glucocorticoids, so basically cortisol, and it's necessary for them, but it has almost functionally the equivalent of having chronic stress, low levels of stress. So then what's interesting is if you're comparing brains between CAH and control children, well, if you see a difference across CAH across the board in males and females, it's probably driven by glucocorticoids, whether that means the prenatal absence or the supplementation into childhood and adulthood. But if it's an effect you only see in females, like the spatial cognition and the personality differences, it's probably driven by the prenatal androgens. So it's a nice natural experiment that can disentangle those two effects.
That is really, really fascinating. That it's something I'm gonna have to think a lot about. I mean, some of the questions that come to mind when you were talking about that is, again, the definition of stress. Is stress really equivalent to amount of cortisol? And even then, you can adapt if that's all
Mhm,
they've known. If they're being treated from the beginning with that, does that really equivalate to,
mhm,
to that sort of stress?
yeah,
That's interesting, and it would be really great to see, because you're talking more about the extremes,
mhm,
right? The genitalia and personality and identifying as gay, better spatial cognition, um, and yeah, you've talked about all the male things, but all the female things that they're leaving as well. But
uh-huh,
again, when is that differentiation come about? That's fascinating
mhm,
and very, very timely to
right.
understand. Right.
So in that case, it's clearly only prenatal influence, but then there's the open question of what about reorganizational effects on the brain during puberty? And I've gotten really interested in these extremes just as a way of helping craft whatever my theoretical framework is, even though I'm mostly interested in typical development. So another one, the most extreme intersex disorder that I've learned about is complete androgen insensitivity. This is where you have a genetic male, XY chromosomes. And I always thought that most of the physiological differences you see between males and females, like having a penis, is somehow genetically coded. And I only learned last year in grad school that the Y chromosome determines whether testes or ovaries are produced in the womb 6 weeks into fetal development. But in all other respects, the fetus is identical across males and females. Like you talk about this female being sort of the blank slate configuration, like nipples develop really early on, which is why both men and women have nipples, even though the males don't really need them. And from then on, after 6 weeks into fetal development, the testes begin producing testosterone. But then in males with CAIS, the testosterone is produced, but the androgen receptors don't work. So it doesn't bind to anything. And functionally, it's equivalent to them having no testosterone. So then you might think that, well, I don't know what would happen, but the low levels of estrogen and progesterone that males have are enough to grow a vagina. So they develop basically as typically female. They'll be identified as female at birth. They look completely healthy. And unless you're doing genetic testing, which you'd have no reason to do, no reason to think this isn't a completely healthy girl. So then you might think, well, they don't have any testosterone action, so they can't go through male puberty, but they don't have ovaries, so they can't go through female puberty, but they actually do. The low levels of estrogen and progesterone are enough for them to grow breasts and for fat to redistribute around the hips and other secondary sex characteristics to develop. So they'll grow up as girls, they'll identify as women. Most of them are straight women attracted to men. So you would think that whatever determines gender identity and sexuality is less so genetic, but maybe driven by prenatal hormone exposure. But they'll never have a period because they don't have ovaries. So generally, they don't find out anything is wrong until they're in their late teens and have never gotten their period. And you find out the reason for that is they don't have ovaries. They have testes inside their abdomen that never descended. And they're
Wow.
genetically male, but in all other respects, they're essentially infertile women. So that again got me thinking prenatal hormones explain a lot. But this is all specifically prenatal androgens. They have the most massive effects. But the historical parallel here is it just that female sex hormones are more subtle or understudied? So, similarly with sexual selection, most of the focus from Darwin onwards was on males. Like you have the classic intra male competition, whether that's through violence and you develop armaments or trying to develop ornaments to attract females. But for the most part, females were more passive and all the focus was on male sexual selection. And in the past few decades, there's been much more focus on female sexual selection. And similarly with hormones, especially prenatally, all the focus is on androgens. And I see why, because you have these massive effects, like on spatial cognition and potentially on gender identity development and sexual orientation, and even on your physiology. Because again, I thought that there was something unique maybe about the second X chromosome that gives you a vagina and breasts, but it turns out males will develop that too in complete absence of testosterone. So then the
Interesting.
question is, are these sex differences that we see at puberty, like increased sensation seeking in males? There's a really nice, simple story that you can tell about, well, testosterone we know is associated with dopamine signaling and receptor density. So more testosterone in males means more dopamine, means more sensation seeking and risk taking. And it fits with the evolutionary idea of males might be more incentivized to pursue high risk, high reward mating strategies. But again, that treats females as passive. And there's other animal research, although I don't understand it very well, of unique but more subtle relationships between estrogen and progesterone and reward sensitivity or different structural forms of brain development. But it's much harder to tell a story about it. So that's what I've been wrestling with recently.
Yeah. No, there's this is great. I love that you're thinking about at things evolutionarily and timely historically as well as to what the demands are. I was not aware of any of these different sorts of I don't want to call them disorders. They're just different types of trajectories, and you could even think about it as also a story of adaptation, right? It's especially those CAIS,
Hmm.
yeah, where they won't even know,
Yeah.
and here they have adapted based probably on environment, and I don't know what the treatment is and so forth to to be a certain fashion, and it really speaks to the influence that happens at that level.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the interesting thing about viewing these, again, like natural experiments in this nature nurture way. That's what this whole podcast is about. Because then you have people, well, for girls with CAIS or with CAH, they're both identified as female at birth and socialized as girls. But the ones with CAH, which are for the most part identical in all other respects, except for the prenatal testosterone being heightened, are more masculine. And then the girls with CAIS, well, yes, they're socialized as girls and they turn out feminine, but they're also genetically male. So that rules out the genetic possibility there.
So do the CAH, can they reproduce?
I think most of them can. If it's extreme virilization, like to the point that their genitalia aren't working, then maybe not. But for the most part, it's low enough levels of testosterone exposure that are still much higher than the typical female range, but it's mostly these subtle organizational effects on the brain and less so on their physiology.
Very interesting because the other group, the CAIS, they will not reproduce,
Hmm.
right? So um it's not adaptive in the sense of being able to have that genetic aspect
Uh-huh.
persist, right?
I'll tell you about one more interesting condition, and this is relevant to our interest in puberty, although I don't know anyone doing neurodevelopmental research on this population. So it's 5 alpha reductase deficiency. And that's an enzyme which converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, which is a more potent form. So during fetal development, usually what happens is you get testosterone and that's acting on the brain and producing some physiological changes. But for the most part, the penis is constructed from dihydrotestosterone signaling. So these are genetic males who have male typical levels of testosterone, but not dihydrotestosterone. So they may still be identified as male at birth, but they might have a micropenis, or in extreme cases, might even be identified as female at birth. But then at puberty, they get the normal surge of testosterone, which facilitates secondary sex characteristics. So they start deepening their voice and growing facial hair and other male characteristics. But again, their penis doesn't develop or is absent entirely. So then that's a really interesting condition where some of those who were raised as girls and suddenly go through male puberty, they might go on testosterone suppression in order to continue to live their lives as women, or some of them might transition and now start identifying as males and maybe get a phalloplasty, a bottom surgery to have that match their male identity.
Wow. This is fascinating, and, I don't know, we wrote this paper, Orma Ravindranath and Maria Parika were the co-first authors, and then, a colleague of mine, oh my god, I'm forgetting his name, he's wonderful, he's trans male, and it was all about, um, gender affirming care. And I'm like a middle author because I wanted, this was their level expertise, and it was very much about how they were so mad that legislators were misinterpreting the information of like, hey, the brain takes a long time to develop. Therefore, you cannot make decisions of gender affirming care until you're 25 or something like that. And they're like, they're not getting it. And it really, so we talked about it. I've informed the US Supreme Court, and I've been involved in other things where you have to translate neuroscience into legislation. So I was like, we cannot have opinions here, just hard facts. And so the whole paper is about what is the decision making process that you need to make the sort of decisions like gender affirming care that have a long-term consequence. And pretty much saying, that whole process takes a very, very long time to occur. And,
Mhm.
you're in settings where there's no distraction, you don't have your peers around, and you're really able to engage adult level systems and have the capacity to make these more long-term medical decisions. And then you have to revisit it again and again because it takes years for that whole process to
Uh-huh.
occur. So a lot of these sorts of issues, have come up. And I mean, from what you said, it really reminded me of this other consequence.
Mhm. And normally in the juvenile justice space, you hear this argument of your brain's still developing into the 20s. Should an 18-year-old really be treated as if they have adult level decision making capacity? And maybe for punishment's sake, they shouldn't. But I really like what you're saying here about it's not that they can't engage that level of executive function altogether. It's just that maybe they're more distracted or it's more
Exactly.
draining. They have to be in the right context.
And that's very much the argument. To be and of course, there's the other repercussion that if they don't have the support to match their identity, it increases mental illnesses and it causes harm. So that it's very important to think about this in a very careful manner about what this individual, is capable of doing and their introspection as to who they are.
Mhm.
I was blown away by these grad students. It was them, I was just involved in the conversation.
Uh-huh. I think that's a great place to wrap up. I love the work you're doing, Bea, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
I can't wait. I'll see you at Flux when you're looking for postdocs. Give me a call.
Thank you.